Like tectonic plates grinding beneath continents, it moved slowly, inexorably, invisibly, until the moment of rupture would arrive. The Second World War had concluded only 16 years prior, but its scars remained raw and bleeding in the minds of those who governed the world. Europe had been split like a cracked vase, hastily glued together by competing powers. On one side, the capitalist West, under American influence. On the other, the socialist East, under the Soviet star. The Iron Curtain, though metaphorical in Churchill's original phrasing, became terribly real, a barrier of barbed wire, concrete, suspicion, and fear. The year 1961 began with a symbolic transition of power. On January 20th, John Fitzgerald Kennedy stood at the steps of the United States Capitol and delivered his inaugural address. Young, eloquent, and untested, he represented a generational shift in leadership. His speech, with its elegant cadences and rhetorical flourishes, masked the brutal realities of the world he was inheriting. An arms race spiraling toward absurdity, an intelligence war fought in alleys and jungles, and a nuclear arsenal primed like a set of clockwork mousetraps ready to snap shut with world-ending consequence. In Moscow, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev ruled with bombast and calculation. He banged his shoe on podiums, but behind closed doors he brooded over missiles, doctrine, and the humiliating strategic imbalance that plagued the Soviet position. The United States possessed hundreds more intercontinental ballistic missiles, a vast fleet of bombers and nuclear submarines prowling the world's oceans. Khrushchev, deeply aware of this disparity, resolved to rectify it, not with parity, but with surprise. By March 1961, the Soviet military began quietly transporting medium-range ballistic missiles across the vast expanse of its Eurasian territory. Their intended destination, however, lay far beyond the Urals, beyond the Black Sea, beyond the Atlantic. Their destination was Cuba. Fidel Castro's revolution had taken hold in 1959, and by 1961, Cuba had drifted irrevocably into the Soviet orbit. To Moscow, this presented a strategic gift. To Washington, a strategic nightmare. The island sat a mere 90 miles from the coast of Florida, close enough for a missile to reach Washington, D.C. in under 15 minutes. In April 1961, the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion attempted to dislodge Castro's regime. It failed, humiliating the Kennedy administration and pushing Havana further into Khrushchev's embrace. That same month, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth, and the Soviets declared victory in the space race's first round. The triumph was technical, psychological, and cultural. For American policymakers, it confirmed their worst fears, that the Soviet Union was not only competitive, but potentially superior in the technologies that mattered most. These were not just missiles. These were symbols of existential threat. These were weapons that could end the world in half an hour. Meanwhile, the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961 turned the simmering division of Germany into a visible scar on the face of Europe. Families were torn apart. Armed guards watched over streets once filled with commuters and children. Kennedy, touring West Berlin, declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." The phrase echoed across the airwaves, but beneath it lay a grim truth. The Cold War was no longer abstract. It was bricks. It was concrete. It was real. Throughout late 1961 and into the early months of 1962, the strategic chessboard was populated with ever more perilous pieces. American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey pointed toward Soviet cities, and Soviet naval traffic increased in and out of Cuban harbors. Spy satellites, newly operational, captured blurred images of suspicious clearings in the Cuban countryside. The CIA pored over these photos with growing unease, noting long cylindrical objects camouflaged beneath netting, long enough and wide enough to match the dimensions of Soviet R-12 and R-14 missiles. Kennedy's ExComm, his executive committee of the National Security Council, met frequently in secret, often late into the night, reviewing intelligence and rehearsing scenarios. Military advisors urged airstrikes. Diplomatic voices pleaded for caution. Kennedy, locked in his own internal debate, walked a knife's edge. He was still haunted by the Bay of Pigs. He feared a second misstep might not only damage his presidency, but ignite a conflict from which there would be no return. And yet, the preparations continued. In underground silos across the American Midwest, crews drilled tirelessly, rehearsing the launch of Minuteman missiles. In the Soviet Far East, Tu-95 bombers sat ready on icy runways, their engines kept warm by kerosene heaters. Civil defense pamphlets circulated through schools and offices. Duck and cover, build a shelter, stock canned food, radiation burns, fallout maps, mushroom clouds. These words became part of daily life, yet always just below the surface, like a horror whispered but never seen. By the spring of 1962, the atmosphere was dense with dread. There was a sense, unspoken but omnipresent, that history had reached a junction from which it could not easily return. And still, no missiles had been fired. No alarms had sounded. The world, suspended in a moment of uneasy calm, continued to turn. Then came the summer. Soviet freighters, heavy with unmarked crates, docked in Cuban ports under cover of diplomatic routine. Anti-aircraft batteries sprang up across the island. Radar stations were constructed. Cuban soldiers drilled alongside Soviet technicians. American analysts watched, noted, questioned, but did not yet act. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance plane flew over western Cuba and photographed, with terrifying clarity, the construction of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites. The images left no doubt. The missiles were there. They were operational. They were aimed at the United States. Kennedy, upon viewing the photographs, reportedly turned pale. The moment had arrived. The gathering storm, long feared and long denied, was now upon them. The president convened ExCom immediately. Over the next 48 hours, the most intense debate of the Cold War unfolded behind closed doors. Airstrikes were weighed against a full invasion. A naval blockade, termed a quarantine for legal reasons, was proposed and implemented. Meanwhile, the world, oblivious at first, went about its ordinary life. Children went to school, clerks opened shops, radios played music, but above it all, like a thin film over the day's sunlight, a tension began to spread. The newspapers reported a situation in Cuba. TV anchors spoke with furrowed brows. Air raid sirens were tested in dozens of cities. Families quietly gathered in basements, wondering whether to stay or flee. Gasoline stations experienced long lines. Bread vanished from shelves. Letters were hurriedly written, just in case they were the last. The storm had gathered. The winds were beginning to howl. And in the Kremlin and the White House, men paced, argued, waited. The buttons remained unpressed. The missiles remained silent. For now. The morning of October 15th, 1962, dawned without distinction. There was no ominous wind, no thunder in the sky, no rupture in the rhythm of daily life across the Western Hemisphere. And yet, within the heavily guarded walls of the United States intelligence community, a moment had arrived which would change the trajectory of the modern world. A small team of analysts, deep within the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, unrolled a strip of 70mm film from the previous day's U-2 reconnaissance flight over western Cuba. They placed it under the lens of a light table, adjusted the magnification, and saw, beyond speculation, beyond hypothesis, the unmistakable shape of missile launch pads under construction. The long, oblong structures were flanked by launch vehicles, trucks, fuel reservoirs, maintenance sheds, patterns of disturbed earth. These were not defensive batteries. These were Soviet R-12 Divina intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of delivering a 1-megaton thermonuclear warhead to nearly every major city in the continental United States, from Boston to Dallas. Their deployment in Cuba collapsed the protective distance the Americans had relied on since the start of the nuclear age. President John F. Kennedy was briefed later that day. The room was silent. The consequences were immediate, incalculable, and dizzying in their severity. The existence of these missiles on Cuban soil did not merely shift the balance of power, it upended it entirely. The United States, long accustomed to strategic dominance, suddenly found itself under direct, immediate threat. The president ordered the creation of a high-level advisory body known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExCom. Composed of the most senior voices in defense, intelligence, diplomacy, and military leadership, this council would guide the president through the most dangerous crisis of the nuclear age. The initial meeting of ExCom was tense. General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, advocated for immediate airstrikes to eliminate the missile sites. Others, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, warned that such an attack could kill Soviet soldiers and provoke retaliation, possibly in Berlin, possibly across Europe, or perhaps directly upon American soil. The possibility that nuclear weapons could be used in response loomed like a sword suspended by a thread. Kennedy himself remained quiet for long stretches, listening, thinking, weighing the words of his advisors. The path ahead branched in 1,000 directions, each more perilous than the last. He knew that a single misstep could lead not only to war, but to the annihilation of civilization itself. That evening, the decision was made to impose a naval blockade around Cuba. Officially, it was called a quarantine, a deliberate euphemism designed to avoid the connotations of war. American warships would surround the island, preventing further deliveries of Soviet military equipment. The world was not yet informed. The public continued to dine, shop, stroll, and sleep. The next morning, American naval forces began moving into position. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines took up station along routes identified as likely Soviet supply paths. At the same time, military readiness across the continental United States was raised to DEFCON 3. B-52 bombers were armed with nuclear weapons and placed on airborne alert, continuously flying patterns over the Arctic, prepared to retaliate at a moment's notice. The Soviet response was swift, if deliberately ambiguous. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko met with President Kennedy on October 18th and assured him, with impeccable calm and convincing diction, that Soviet aid to Cuba was entirely defensive. Even as he spoke, more freighters loaded with missile components and warheads were approaching the Caribbean Sea. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation via television and radio. For many Americans, this was the moment they realized the gravity of the situation. The president, speaking with clear and deliberate cadence, informed the public of the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. He announced the naval quarantine and called on Khrushchev to remove the weapons immediately. The response was panic and paralysis in equal measure. Across the country, families scrambled to purchase canned goods, bottled water, and fuel. Schoolchildren were instructed once more in the old rituals of duck and cover. Basements were hastily converted into makeshift fallout shelters. In cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Atlanta, rumors of impending air raids caused traffic jams that stretched for miles. The following days became a dance on the edge of a blade. On October 24th, Soviet ships carrying missile parts approached the quarantine line. American naval vessels waited, engines humming, crews at battle stations. In command centers, fingers hovered near triggers. Then, at the last moment, the Soviet vessels slowed. Some turned back. It was a gesture, a flicker of restraint. But no one yet knew whether it meant de-escalation or merely tactical adjustment. In Washington and Moscow, messages were exchanged with increasing frequency and desperation. Telegrams, coded cables, intermediaries at the United Nations. Each word was scrutinized, debated, and interpreted through layers of suspicion. What did provocative consequences mean? Did urgent necessity imply threat or warning? Then, on October 27th, the crisis reached its breaking point. A U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Anderson died instantly. The moment was electric. Kennedy's military advisors urged immediate retaliation. The logic was clear. An American pilot had been killed. A line had been crossed. Failure to respond would project weakness. But Kennedy hesitated. He had read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. He knew how nations, acting with logic and honor, had stumbled into the inferno of World War I. He was determined not to do the same. And yet, elsewhere in the command chain, tensions spiraled. A Soviet submarine, B-59, was cornered by American destroyers in the Sargasso Sea. The Americans dropped signaling depth charges, unaware that the submarine carried a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Inside the vessel, air grew thin. The captain believed war had already begun. Only the intervention of one man, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented the launch of the torpedo. Simultaneously, XCOM received two messages from Moscow. The first, moderate in tone, offered a path to resolution. The missiles would be removed from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade the island. The second, more aggressive and issued later the same day, demanded the removal of American missiles from Turkey. The situation was spiraling. There were too many actors, too many weapons, too much mistrust. Each side feared the other might strike preemptively. Each assumed the other had no intention of backing down. Within the missile sites in Cuba, Soviet forces waited. Many were young conscripts, unfamiliar with the terrain, exhausted from the tropical heat and constant tension. They were under orders, but those orders were flexible. If attacked, they could launch. If communications were lost, they might interpret silence as war. Doctrines blurred. Timetables shifted. The world stood breathless, one heartbeat away from fire. And so, the night of October 27th became the most dangerous night in human history. Unknown to the public, unmarked on calendars. No air raid sirens rang, no missiles launched. Yet, the final decisions loomed. One more mistake, one more misread cable, one more impulsive command, and the Cold War would erupt into unimaginable heat. The hour of reckoning had nearly come. The dawn of October 28, 1962, crept slowly over the eastern horizon, bathing Washington in a soft, autumnal light. But for those within the White House, there was no morning, no night, only a gray continuum of urgent meetings, intercepted messages, and the slowly tightening coil of fate. The previous night had tested the nerves of every man in the room. The president had paced in silence, his tie loosened, his brow furrowed with the weight of impossible choices. At 6 a.m., a new intelligence briefing arrived. U-2 flights over Cuba confirmed that the missile sites were now fully operational. Launch platforms complete, warheads in position, support vehicles on standby, operational readiness within hours, perhaps less. And then came the news that could not be ignored. At 6:41 a.m., communication was lost with an American destroyer patrolling the quarantine line. Radio silence, no distress call, no radar return. An unconfirmed sonar contact indicated a possible Soviet torpedo launch. An explosion had been detected by underwater acoustic stations near Guantanamo Bay just minutes prior. In real history, it was a false alarm, a mechanical failure, misread sonar, or natural occurrence. But in this alternate timeline, it was not. The destroyer had been hit. The USS Pierce, a Fletcher-class destroyer, sank beneath the waves with 287 men aboard. Word of its loss reached the Oval Office just before 7 a.m. There was no time for mourning, no time for hesitation. The United States had suffered a direct attack. Blood had been shed. The Rubicon had been crossed. President Kennedy, still striving for diplomacy, hesitated. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not. They insisted the window for surprise was closing. The longer the United States waited, the greater the chance that the Soviet missile crews in Cuba would strike first. The calculus was brutally simple: strike now or suffer first strike. At 7:12 a.m., under immense pressure and lacking confirmation of Soviet intent, Kennedy authorized a limited airstrike against the known missile sites in western Cuba. The operation, codenamed Scalpel, would be launched from aircraft carriers in the Caribbean and air bases in Florida. The goal? Surgical elimination of the launch sites before they could be used. The timeline, immediate. At 8:03 a.m., the first wave of F-105, Thunder Chiefs, and F-8 Crusaders lifted off into the sky, armed with conventional munitions. Accompanying them were B-47 bombers carrying nuclear gravity bombs as a contingency, should the first wave fail. As they neared Cuban airspace, radar silence turned to static. The pilots descended toward their targets, flying low to avoid detection. The missile sites came into view, long concrete strips, crews scurrying in confusion, trucks moving beneath camouflage nets. Bombs dropped, explosions bloomed, fire engulfed the missile fields. But they were too late. On the outskirts of San Cristobal, Site A-1 had gone hot. A Soviet R-12 missile, fueled and armed, had already received its launch order from the local command. The launch was not authorized by Khrushchev himself. Indeed, Moscow had not yet even received confirmation of the American strike. But the Soviet field doctrine had given local commanders conditional authority to retaliate if attacked directly. They interpreted the bombing as the beginning of a full-scale invasion. At 8:37 a.m., from a patch of Cuban soil still slick with morning dew, the R-12 missile roared into the sky. Its destination, Homestead Air Force Base, Florida. The missile arced into the upper atmosphere, its trajectory almost too perfect. American early warning systems registered the launch within 90 seconds. NORAD confirmed impact calculations. Homestead had only 12 minutes. Evacuation was impossible. At 8:49 a.m., and a 1-megaton warhead detonated above Homestead. The blast vaporized the airbase, obliterated surrounding communities, and sent a column of fire and smoke 10 miles into the sky. The mushroom cloud was visible from Miami Beach. Windows shattered from the pressure wave as far north as Fort Lauderdale. Emergency services collapsed under the weight of the injured, the incinerated, the blinded. The United States had been hit with a nuclear weapon for the first time in its history. The response was instantaneous. At 9:04 a.m., Kennedy authorized Operation Iron Echo, a strategic counterstrike against additional missile sites in Cuba and Soviet installations suspected to house nuclear arms. This second wave did not carry conventional weapons. It carried nuclear warheads. B-47s and B-52s launched from bases across the southeastern United States. Their payloads ranged from kiloton to megaton-class devices. Targets included Soviet airfields in Cuba, coastal radar stations, and secondary launch sites. Within the hour, 5 nuclear devices were detonated across the Cuban landscape. Havana was spared for the moment, but Santiago de Cuba, home to a major Soviet logistics hub, was not. The Caribbean Sea churned with radioactive ash. At 10:28 a.m., Washington time, Moscow received confirmation of multiple nuclear detonations in Cuba and the destruction of a Soviet missile battery. Khrushchev, aged and weary, stood in the Kremlin war room and placed his hand upon the table. His advisors urged retaliation. The military staff spoke in terms of doctrine and proportion. Soviet submarines already prowled the Atlantic. Their SLBMs were within range. And yet, Khrushchev hesitated. He dispatched a cable to Kennedy via the Washington-Moscow hotline, imploring de-escalation, calling for a ceasefire, offering to withdraw all missiles in exchange for an end to the bombardment. The cable never arrived. At 10:42 a.m., a second U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down, this time over eastern Cuba. It was interpreted by the Pentagon as evidence of a continuing Soviet offensive. Worse still, an American radar station in Greenland detected what appeared to be an ICBM launch from Soviet territory. The alert level was raised to DEFCON 1, the highest possible. Within 15 minutes, the United States Strategic Air Command received the full go order. Execute PSYOP 62, the single integrated operational plan designed to destroy Soviet military capabilities in a single overwhelming strike. By 11:12 a.m., 183 American missiles were airborne. Targets: Moscow, Leningrad, Vladivostok, Sevastopol, Kiev, Murmansk, Novosibirsk. Simultaneously, SAC bombers flew deep into Soviet airspace. And in return, inevitably, irrevocably, the Soviet response was launched. From beneath the Arctic Ocean, from deep silos in Kazakhstan, from mobile launchers in the forests of Belarus, missiles screamed into the stratosphere. The United Kingdom was among the first struck. London, obliterated at 11:53 a.m. Birmingham and Glasgow followed. In Germany, Bonn vanished in fire. In France, Paris burned. And then at 12:16 p.m., multiple Soviet missiles struck the United States mainland. New York City, Chicago, Omaha, Washington, D.C. In the nation's capital, the White House and Capitol Hill were reduced to radioactive rubble. Kennedy's last known location was within the Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the East Wing. Communications ceased at 12:17 p.m. The Cold War had turned hot, and the Earth, for the first time in its long history, was aflame with the weapons of its own invention. The first day passed not like a day at all, but as a distortion of time itself. The hours, normally measured by clocks and meals and sunlight, fractured under the weight of relentless destruction. The concepts of morning, afternoon, and evening lost all meaning. Instead, there were only moments of impact, each announced by tremors, each accompanied by waves of heat, sound, and silence. It was a symphony of endings, repeated with mechanical efficiency across continents. As American missiles arced toward Soviet soil and Soviet missiles thundered back across the polar skies toward North America, another front awakened to its own death. Europe, long the anxious epicenter of Cold War tension, now found itself under direct bombardment. The continent that had twice burned in the great wars of the 20th century would burn once more, but this time there would be no trenches, no armistice, and no rebuilding. At 12:21 p.m., GMT, the first wave of Soviet SS-4 missiles crossed into NATO airspace. The United Kingdom was struck with calculated precision. A 1-megaton warhead detonated above London at 12:23 p.m. The fireball engulfed Westminster, Whitehall, and the entirety of central London. The Palace of Westminster, Buckingham Palace, and the Tower of London, all gone within seconds. The Thames turned to steam. The city's ancient bones were reduced to a fusion of ash and glass. The shockwave traveled outward for miles. In suburbs like Wimbledon and Croydon, windows shattered in an instant. Firestorms followed. Those who were not vaporized outright were scorched, suffocated, or left to wander through streets that no longer existed. Minutes later, Birmingham and Manchester were struck, then Glasgow. In total, 5 warheads fell on the British Isles within 30 minutes. The government had already fled to underground bunkers near Corsham and Kelvedon Hatch, but communications were failing. The BBC broadcast for the final time at 12:47 p.m., a pre-recorded message informing citizens to remain indoors and await instructions that would never come. Across the English Channel, France suffered in near synchrony. Paris was struck at 12:29 p.m., the warhead detonating just above the Ile de la Cité. The Eiffel Tower disappeared in a blossom of fire. Notre Dame Cathedral crumbled. The Seine boiled. The Élysée Palace vanished, along with the government within it. Lyon and Marseille were hit next, and a final missile, perhaps intended for Bordeaux, fell short and exploded in the countryside, igniting forests and villages with equal ferocity. Germany, divided though it was, became a single target. Soviet doctrine had long planned for the complete neutralization of West German military assets in the event of war. The cities of Bonn, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Stuttgart were all struck. In East Germany, American bombers responded in kind. Dresden, Leipzig, and East Berlin burned. No ideology could shield a city from fire. Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, all suffered similar fates. NATO command in Brussels was reduced to rubble. Rotterdam's ports became craters. Copenhagen's skyline disappeared beneath a mushroom cloud. And yet, the machines continued. In Spain, Madrid was struck at 1:03 p.m. Lisbon, capital of neutral Portugal, was hit in what may have been a targeting error, or a deliberate warning to other neutral powers. Rome followed at 1:11 p.m. The Vatican was reduced to smoke. Pilgrims and cardinals alike perished in silence, buried beneath the marble of St. Peter's Basilica. The flames of war did not discriminate between the sacred and the secular. By the close of the first day, over 60 major cities across Europe lay in ruins. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Power grids collapsed. Trains stopped mid-journey, their passengers emerging into unfamiliar landscapes of broken glass and irradiated debris. In basements and metro tunnels, survivors huddled and prayed, if not for salvation, then for mercy. And still, the war raged on. In the Atlantic Ocean, American and Soviet submarines engaged in silent, lethal duels. Sonar pings echoed through the deep, followed by torpedoes, implosions, and the occasional terrifying sight of a nuclear-tipped missile launching from beneath the sea. Polaris and R-21 missiles rose from the waves like sea serpents of apocalypse. The North American continent, already burning from the strikes on New York, Washington, and Homestead, now faced the second wave. Soviet missiles struck the Midwest, targeting missile silos in North Dakota, command centers in Nebraska, and air bases across Kansas and Missouri. Chicago was hit at 1:28 p.m. local time. The Loop, Grant Park, the Chicago River, all erased. The Sears Tower, once a symbol of American modernity, became a skeleton wrapped in flame before crumbling to earth. Detroit followed, then Minneapolis, then Dallas. On the West Coast, American forces prepared for strikes from Soviet bombers over the Pacific. Air raid sirens howled in San Francisco and Los Angeles. The public fled to overpasses and underground car parks, clinging to transistor radios that now spoke only static or whispered rumors of nuclear hell. By hour 24, the skies above both hemispheres had changed. A brown haze blanketed the earth. The sun no longer shone with clarity. Ash drifted in upper currents. The wind carried radiation. Birds fell from the sky. Trees stood blackened, their bark stripped away by blast waves. Rivers ran thick with debris. In bunkers across North America and Europe, governments attempted to maintain the semblance of control. Emergency broadcast systems issued pre-written instructions on civil defense. Ration water, avoid exposure, report injuries to designated triage centers. But the instructions assumed infrastructure. Roads no longer existed. Hospitals were craters. There were no phones, no electricity, no hierarchy, only survivors. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the devastation was equally immense. Moscow was struck 3 times. The Kremlin, Red Square, the Bolshoi Theater, all incinerated. Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, and Yekaterinburg followed. Nuclear detonations rippled across Siberia, targeting strategic railways, missile silos, and oil facilities. The Volga burned. Khrushchev's final known message, a short, desperate cable, was sent from a hardened command bunker near Ulyanovsk. It read only, "Cease fire, for the sake of life." No reply ever came. As the second day began, survivors across the northern hemisphere faced new terrors. Not fire, not impact, but radiation. Fallout swept across thousands of kilometers. In the absence of wind patterns to disperse the ash, it fell in concentrated sheets. Rain turned to acid. Skin blistered in minutes. Cows collapsed in their fields. Crops wilted overnight. In areas where no bombs had fallen, Canada, Ireland, the Nordic countries, people still died. The third day dawned darker still. With the global communications network almost entirely dismantled, the isolated pockets of survivors did not know who else still lived. Mayors became presidents, soldiers became governors, doctors became lawgivers. Civilization, such as it was, devolved into cells of frightened humanity. In Denver, a group of federal staff members who had survived in the Cheyenne mountain complex emerged to find the city erased. Ash covered the landscape. No cars moved. No birds sang. The silence was maddening. A single transistor radio picked up a weak transmission from a naval vessel off the coast of Alaska, reporting heavy losses but continued survival. In Stockholm, unscathed by direct impact, the Swedish government attempted to open communications with Finland and Norway. No reply. In South America, radio operators in Buenos Aires and Santiago tried to establish links with embassies in Washington and London. Silence. In the Pacific, Australia began activating contingency plans. Canberra issued martial law. In Perth and Brisbane, survivors gathered in sports stadiums where foreign embassies now served as emergency triage centers. The world had not ended, but it had ceased to function. In 72 hours, over 500 million lives had been lost. Entire languages, cities, institutions, and histories burned away in the wind. And the war was not yet over. In the waning hours of the third day, as the earth groaned under the weight of its own destruction, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the great defensive pact forged in the hopeful years following the Second World War, was still operational in name. Its member states had been targeted, its cities reduced to dust. But within deep command bunkers aboard airborne command posts, and in the reinforced caverns beneath mountains, remnants of NATO's command and control structure still flickered with life. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers, Europe, SHAPE, traditionally headquartered near Paris, had been relocated to a secure complex in Mons, Belgium, prior to the outbreak of war. That facility, despite electromagnetic pulses and seismic shock waves, survived the first days of nuclear exchange. Within its concrete chambers, generals and staff officers worked by the light of oil lamps and emergency power, surrounded by static-filled radios, rationed water, and maps stained with soot. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the American Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SECUR, had survived, protected in a reinforced vault just days before the French capital was obliterated. His voice, hoarse from lack of sleep and filtered through shortwave interference, issued a message on day 4 that would be picked up intermittently by the few remaining NATO forces. This is not surrender. We remain. We coordinate. We survive. But survival was becoming a relative term. The alliance's military backbone, its battalions, air squadrons, and naval fleets, had been gutted. The West German Bundeswehr had ceased to function as a coherent body after the annihilation of Bonn and Frankfurt. British and American forces stationed in West Germany, once poised for a Warsaw Pact invasion, were scattered, sheltering in disused bunkers or retreating toward the Rhine. Entire mechanized brigades had vanished beneath radioactive ash. In Italy, The NATO Southern Command, formerly based in Naples, was vaporized in the early hours of the second day. A backup installation in Verona struggled to maintain contact with Turkish and Greek forces, but line-of-sight communications were limited, and atmospheric interference rendered most frequencies useless. Turkey, a crucial outpost of NATO's southeastern flank, had been struck by Soviet missiles launched from the Caucasus. Ankara was hit. Izmir was burning. The American Jupiter missiles that had once pointed menacingly toward Soviet cities were now twisted relics beneath irradiated sky. Turkish military units attempted to organize defensive perimeters around remaining logistical hubs, but no orders came, no supplies arrived, and the roads were clogged with survivors fleeing the smoldering cities. And yet, amidst this unraveling, military instinct endured. Naval forces in the North Atlantic, including Task Force 60 and elements of the British Royal Navy, maintained formation. Submarines still moved in the dark below the waves, some unaware of the full scale of the devastation above. American and British attack subs intercepted what Soviet vessels they could locate, launching torpedoes and evading counterfire in a grim underwater continuation of the war. Aboard aircraft carriers, such as the USS Enterprise and HMS Ark Royal, air wings operated in emergency rotation, striking suspected Soviet submarine bases in Norway and northern Russia. Without satellite coverage, targeting was often based on outdated intelligence and guesswork. Bombs fell on fjords, fishing towns, and abandoned radar stations alike. Reports filtered in of Soviet forces launching retaliatory strikes from the Kola Peninsula toward Iceland and Greenland. Reykjavik was struck. Thule Air Base in northwest Greenland was hit with a 500-kiloton warhead. The Arctic glowed with radioactive fire. In France, what remained of the Foreign Legion held defensive lines near Lyon, fighting not Soviet troops, but waves of starving civilians fleeing the blast zones. Civil unrest overtook military protocol. Ammunition was rationed. Mutiny was whispered. A lieutenant colonel in Dijon wrote in his field log, "The war is over. We are simply acting out its final gestures." The Scandinavian nations, some NATO-aligned, others neutral, fared little better. Oslo, Stockholm, and Helsinki had not been primary targets, but fallout from attacks in northern Europe drifted relentlessly across the region. Swedish emergency preparedness, long touted as the model of neutral resilience, began to fray. Food reserves dwindled. Hospitals operated on candlelight and saline. Reports emerged of Soviet airborne divisions sighted in Lapland, though these may have been hallucinations, panic-fueled fictions born of desperation. In the United Kingdom, the government had relocated to the Central Government War Headquarters in Corsham. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was presumed dead after a direct hit on Chequers. The remaining cabinet ministers broadcast fragmented messages via surviving BBC frequencies, urging the public to maintain calm and cooperate with Home Defense Services. But the Home Defense Services themselves were no longer intact. Local councils became de facto authorities. Mayors declared martial law. Farmers and retired officers led defense committees armed with bolt-action rifles and Geiger counters. In Germany, the once meticulously maintained autobahns became rivers of ash and twisted metal. NATO's Forward Area Alert Radar FAAR systems lay silent, scorched. The inner German border no longer meant anything. The Warsaw Pact's advance, once feared as a mechanized juggernaut, never materialized. Instead, silence reigned. In fact, the Soviet ground forces positioned in Eastern Europe had suffered catastrophic losses as well. Warsaw had been struck by a rogue American bomber on the second day. Prague was in chaos. Budapest burned. Reports from East Berlin ceased entirely. It is unclear whether Soviet high command ever issued orders for a ground invasion of the West, or if they simply lost the ability to do so. The last coherent NATO military engagement took place near the Dutch-German border. A battalion of British infantry, reinforced by remnants of Belgian and Canadian forces, attempted to secure a corridor to Antwerp for the extraction of civilians and supplies. The mission, dubbed Operation Ember, encountered both hostile Soviet troops and local militias. Fighting was brief, brutal, and confused. Friendly fire incidents abounded. Chemical weapons may have been deployed, though no confirmation survived. By the end of the fifth day, the corridor collapsed. Antwerp was hit by a Soviet missile just hours later. The river Scheldt ran red. As the first week of the war closed, NATO, as a functioning alliance, was no more. What remained were fragments, commands without receivers, units without orders, soldiers without nation. Still in the dark recesses of Norwegian fjords, in the bunkers beneath the Scottish Highlands, in the frozen watchposts of Alaska and Greenland, some command structures lingered. An American colonel operating out of an abandoned missile defense site near Keflavik wrote in his final log, "We are still NATO. We remember the oath. If there is a Europe left, we will find it." Yet the reality was inescapable. Europe had fallen, not to an invader, not to a dictator, but to fire. Its cathedrals had crumbled. Its cities glowed red under clouded skies. Its libraries, museums, and parliaments had been reduced to powder and memory. The alliances, the treaties, the visions of shared prosperity that had emerged from the ashes of 1945 were gone. The grand project of post-war unity had ended not in resolution, but in radiation. And beyond the horizons, beyond the decimated cities and broken armies, the survivors began to walk. They walked across fields of glass. They walked beneath skies that rained ash. They walked westward and southward toward rumored sanctuaries that may or may not have existed. They walked through the ruins of NATO, bearing nothing but memories of a world that 3 days before had still seemed unbreakable. The theory behind strategic nuclear exchange, developed over decades in think tanks, war colleges, and command briefings, was grounded in mathematical abstraction. Acronyms, such as MADI, Mutually Assured Destruction, promised equilibrium. A PSYOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, provided the procedural steps. Each warhead, each megaton, each trajectory was accounted for with academic detachment. This was not the rhetoric of fire and death, but of yield distribution, target pairing, redundancy ratios, and circular error probabilities. But in the first week of November 1962, the equations were solved not on chalkboards, but in blood and flame. The initial strategic exchange began with American launches at approximately 8:46 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on what had once been a cool autumn morning in Washington. The order, authenticated via the Emergency Action Message, EAM protocol, was delivered from the Airborne Command Post Looking Glass in coordination with the underground NORAD command at Cheyenne Mountain. The execution code confirmed PSYOP 62 was activated in full. Across missile silos in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming, the ground shook with the ignition of Minuteman Warmer intercontinental ballistic missiles. 45 seconds later, multiple Titan II missiles, each equipped with a 9-megaton W-53 warhead, emerged from silos in Arizona and Arkansas, ascending slowly before vanishing into the upper atmosphere. The target list was immense, almost incomprehensibly so. Soviet command centers, nuclear storage depots, radar installations, submarine pens, airfields, troop formations, industrial cities, all assigned coordinates and redundancies. Many targets were assigned 2 or even 3 warheads to ensure destruction in the face of hardened bunkers or poor accuracy. Each American missile carried multiple re-entry vehicles. The MIRV, Multiple Independently Targetable Re-entry Vehicle, was still in early development, but for the high-yield Titans that was unnecessary. 1 warhead, 1 city. That was enough. By 9:15 a.m., Soviet early warning radar in the Urals detected multiple launches. The infamous Duga radar system, in its embryonic form, relayed fragmented signals to Moscow, where automated protocols were already in motion. Soviet response was swift. The order of retaliatory destruction, code word Vozmezdi, was transmitted via underground cables and airborne relays to strategic rocket forces units spread from Belarus to Kazakhstan. R-7 and R-16 missiles, many of them liquid-fueled and slow to arm, had been placed on heightened readiness the day before. Their ignition was imperfect. Some failed, others veered off course, but the majority launched. At 9:42 a.m., Moscow time, the first Soviet ICBMs crossed the stratosphere on their way to North America. New York, Washington, Chicago, NORAD, SAC headquarters, missile fields, air bases, civilian centers. By 10:03 a.m., the first American re-entry vehicles struck Soviet territory. The city of Minsk vanished in 1.2 seconds. 3 minutes later, a pair of warheads fell on Leningrad. 1 airburst and 1 surface burst. The resulting firestorm consumed nearly 90% of the historic city. Then, Moscow. The first strike targeted the Kremlin and Red Square. The second, aimed at a suspected underground command center, created a crater 2 miles wide. The third struck Kolomna, destroying a key missile assembly plant and releasing a cloud of radioactive dust that would drift south over the course of days. But the destruction did not stop there. Kiev, Volgograd, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk. Each received at least 1 strike. American war planners had expected a large percentage of Soviet missiles to fail. But Soviet engineers, despite chronic underfunding and political interference, had achieved unexpected reliability. Of the 180 long-range Soviet warheads launched in the first salvo, 139 reached their targets. New York City received 2 direct hits, one above Midtown Manhattan, the second over Newark. The Empire State Building disappeared in the flash. The financial district crumbled. The George Washington Bridge melted. Manhattan burned as firestorms leapt across boroughs. 5 million people perished within the hour. Washington, D.C. was struck moments later. The White House, the Capitol, the Pentagon, all evaporated in the glare. Fallout drifted across Maryland and Virginia. Attempts by Secret Service agents to move the president to Mount Weather failed. He perished before reaching the site. Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, St. Louis all met similar fates. In Canada, Ottawa was struck, followed by Montreal and Toronto. The distant early warning, DEW line installations in the Arctic were hit, though many had already been abandoned. Vancouver was spared direct impact, but fallout from Seattle swept northward. Further south, Soviet warheads targeted strategic installations in the western United States. Vandenberg Air Force Base, Edwards Air Force Base, and Los Alamos were among the first to fall. The deserts of Nevada and New Mexico lit up in eerie orange hues as missiles detonated above test sites that had once hosted America's own nuclear experiments. Simultaneously, American warheads fell on Soviet missile fields in Kazakhstan, command bunkers in Uralsk, and naval shipyards in Vladivostok. Secondary targets included Cuba, Romania, Bulgaria, and even parts of China, suspected of harboring Soviet assets. Whether those targets were intentional or the result of miscommunication remains unknown. Strategic Air Command continued operations, even as their home bases burned. B-52 bombers, having launched hours earlier under the positive control plan, carried high-yield bombs on pre-assigned routes over the Arctic and across the Pacific. Some dropped their payloads on Soviet cities already destroyed by ICBMs, ensuring overkill. Others were diverted mid-flight, dropping their bombs on mobile targets or infrastructure hubs. Several were lost to Soviet MiGs or S-75 SAMs. Some turned back, only to find no runway left to land upon. The exchange lasted less than 90 minutes in its initial phase, but secondary and tertiary launches followed in waves. Submarines launched missiles from the North Sea, the Barents Sea, the Sea of Okhotsk, and the Pacific. Soviet Golf-class and American Polaris-class submarines both struck at civilian and military targets with little regard for discrimination. London, Paris, Berlin, Beijing, Tehran, Tokyo, all were struck. Civilian deaths are impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates place the figure at over 400 million in the first week. This figure does not account for delayed fatalities due to radiation, burns, or infrastructure collapse, nor does it account for the millions more who would perish from famine, disease, and exposure in the months and years to follow. Climatic consequences began almost immediately. The atmosphere filled with soot from hundreds of firestorms. Smoke rose not in isolated columns, but in continent-spanning blankets. The jet stream carried radioactive particles across hemispheres. Photosynthesis declined. Within weeks, agricultural output had dropped by over 50% in unaffected areas, and near to zero in directly hit regions. The concept of nuclear winter, later popularized in the 1980s, had not yet been fully formulated in 1962, but its early signs were already visible. Temperatures fell, skies dimmed, crops withered, livestock died. Water sources were tainted with cesium and strontium. Rivers turned black. The world began to cool, but not in peace. In the halls of surviving command centers, plans continued. Strike options were revised. Potential targets in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia were debated. Signals intelligence continued, albeit fragmented. Rumors swirled of surviving Soviet assets in Cuba preparing a follow-up launch. American tactical aircraft in Alaska were ordered to stand by for possible strikes on China in case of its unexpected alignment with the Soviets, but the machines of war had already overperformed. The point had been reached, unmistakably irreversibly, where further destruction ceased to have meaning. There were no more enemy capitals to strike, no military formations to rout, no supply lines to cut, only ash, wind, and silence. And still, humanity lingered. In bunkers and basements and caves and shelters under highway overpasses and in deep mines, people remained. They breathed the thick air. They listened to the static. They took note of the silence. They waited for what they could not say. And above them, the sky darkened with the smoke of 5,000 suns. In the prelude to nuclear exchange, communication had been the one fragile thread still holding the world together. Diplomats whispered across encrypted lines. Generals issued warnings via telex. Intelligence services monitored open frequencies for signs of restraint. Presidents and premiers stared into black telephones that might yet carry words to stop the storm. Then the war began. And, in its wake, words died. The first casualties in any nuclear conflict are not always people nor even buildings. They are signals. The detonation of thermonuclear weapons high in the atmosphere produces a phenomenon known as electromagnetic pulse, EMP. Invisible, instantaneous, and devastating, an EMP floods the surrounding region with intense radio frequency energy. It overloads circuits, melts wiring, disrupts transistors, disables everything from radios to power grids, from telephone exchanges to early satellite systems. On November 3, 1962, 3 high-altitude nuclear bursts, 2 American, 1 Soviet, crippled the electromagnetic spectrum across entire continents. One exploded 400 kilometers above the central United States, another over the Urals, the third above the North Pacific, an accidental detonation triggered by a faulty Polaris missile. The result was a communications apocalypse. Within seconds, hundreds of civilian and military radio networks went dark. Landline exchanges, already stressed by panic traffic, burned out. Microwave relay towers ceased function. Radar systems blinked out one by one, leaving the skies blind. Submarine cables survived, in part. The transatlantic cable connecting the United States to Europe remained physically intact, but its amplifiers and switching stations were rendered inert. Telegraph signals flickered briefly, then fell into incoherence. Operators reported strange ghost pulses. Fragments of messages mid-transmission looped endlessly by failing systems. One British technician recorded a loop of garbled Morse from Reykjavik, repeating for 19 hours before cutting to static. In the Soviet Union, communications were always more centralized and thus more fragile. When Moscow ceased transmission, regional commands fell into paralysis. Backup networks functioned for hours, perhaps days, but their reach was limited. Local commanders began to act independently, unsure of whether they were obeying orders or hallucinating them. In one infamous case, a Soviet general in Rostov interpreted a static-laced signal as an instruction to initiate chemical warfare against suspected NATO remnants in Turkey. He did so. The result was a massacre of refugees already dying from radiation sickness. Meanwhile, in the United States, the emergency broadcast system activated fully for the first and only time. Thousands of AM and FM radio stations across the country relayed the pre-recorded message. This is the emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. But by the time the message concluded, most stations were already silenced by EMP. Those that remained on air operated for hours on diesel generators, transmitting garbled reports of destruction, pleas for calm, and fragments of the president's final address, which itself was never heard in full. Television, too, flickered and failed. The black and white screens that had once carried Walter Cronkite and Richard Dimbleby now showed only dancing snow. One surviving technician at a PBS affiliate in Colorado spent the better part of a day rerouting power to keep the signal alive, playing a looped reel of Beethoven symphonies and instructional broadcasts on basic first aid. He died of radiation poisoning 4 days later. Satellite communication, then in its infancy, offered no rescue. The few functional satellites, Telstar 1, Courier 1B, had limited bandwidth and coverage. Many were rendered blind or inert by orbital EMP and debris. Control centers in Cape Canaveral and Baikonur were vaporized or abandoned. The dream of a globalized network of instant communication died before it had fully materialized. As days passed, the survivors turned to older forms. Ham radio operators, dispersed and decentralized, formed the final nervous system of a dying world. In basements, attics, and cellars, thousands of amateur radio enthusiasts powered up their transceivers, some using hand-cranked generators or car batteries. They attempted to reach one another across the static. Morse returned in earnest. The airwaves clicked with call signs and location pings, but the ionosphere, warped by firestorms and atmospheric soot, betrayed them. Signals bounced unpredictably. Voices doubled back. Entire regions, especially Europe and the eastern United States, became dead zones. Some ham operators recorded everything they could hear. One reel, preserved in a lead-lined crate in Iceland, contains 9 hours of agonized transmissions from Central Europe. German, French, English, Polish, all overlapping. A man weeping, a woman screaming coordinates, a long silence, then a child's voice reciting what seems to be the Lord's Prayer. It ends abruptly. Across Africa and South America, regions largely untouched by direct nuclear strikes, the silence was louder still. Telegraph lines to Europe went unanswered. Radio Luxembourg fell silent. BBC World Service ceased transmission. American relay stations in Brazil and Argentina were cut off. No official declarations, no diplomatic clarifications, no offers of aid. The global South found itself unmoored, alone in a vacuum of sound and trust. In Australia, the government maintained partial communication via undersea cables with New Zealand and for a time with Hawaii, but the signals grew faint. Wellington reported that Honolulu had gone silent. Then came the final message, received with static at 2:43 a.m. Canberra time. They are gone. In Tokyo, panic overtook the telegraph offices as false reports of Soviet invasion flooded the wires. A misinterpretation of a broken signal led to the deployment of Japanese self-defense forces to Hokkaido. In the confusion, 2 American airmen fleeing from Guam were mistakenly detained as enemy agents. The full explanation was never transmitted. The men were executed by a panicked provincial officer whose name is lost to history. Religious stations fared no better. Vatican Radio continued broadcasting Latin prayers for 36 hours before its signal vanished. The Islamic call to prayer, once broadcast from powerful transmitters in Cairo and Mecca, was no longer heard. A Buddhist station in Thailand looped a verse of the Dhammapada until its generator failed. And so, silence became universal. The collapse of communication was more than a technical failure. It was a psychological sundering. Human beings, social by nature and design, found themselves unable to reach one another. No confirmation of survival, no direction, no comfort. Rumors bloomed like mold in the dark. Some believed the war had been a divine punishment and refused all contact. Others hoarded radios like totems, convinced they would hear their loved ones again if they tuned to the right frequency. In the Appalachian Mountains, communities formed around shortwave survivors, electing radio operators as new leaders, not because they could speak, but because they could listen. By the end of the first month, communication existed only in fragments. A Morse transmission from Argentina. "Is there anyone left in London?" A reply from someone in Devon. "Static, gray skies, we are alive." A faint signal from Kerala. "We have food, children are sick." "Does America still exist?" A scratchy message from Quebec. "No response from Ottawa, power limited, please advise." And then, nothing. Where once there had been a world ablaze with sound, telephones ringing, typewriters clacking, radio waves dancing from Tokyo to Berlin, there was now only hush, a world without voice, a world without witness. But in the corners of this ruined earth, some persisted. A teacher in a collapsed New York school used chalk to keep records on the blackened walls. Daily temperatures, casualty estimates, changes in wind direction. She wrote, not because anyone would read them, but because someone should. A priest in southern France took to ringing his chapel bell each evening at 6. No one came. Still, he rang it. A young boy in Uruguay learned Morse from his grandfather, tapping nightly into the darkness with fingers bruised but hopeful. "I'll take. Are you there?" There was never an answer, but the question itself in a world consumed by silence was a kind of defiance, a final whisper of humanity in the void. The nation-state as a political construct is a fragile invention, held together by symbols, laws, borders, and above all by communication and continuity. When these are broken, the abstract notion of country begins to fray. In the aftermath of the 1962 nuclear exchange, that fraying accelerated into disintegration. In the weeks that followed the firestorms and EMPs, central governments, where they still existed, found themselves incapable of exercising authority beyond a few dozen kilometers. With capitals erased and communication shattered, local actors emerged from the ruins, not merely as caretakers, but as successors. In many regions, power devolved to whoever had food, fuel, or firearms. The United States, once a continental superpower, became a fractured mosaic of isolated enclaves. With Washington, D.C. annihilated and most of the federal leadership presumed dead, the continuity of government protocols activated, but ineffectively. Mount Weather, once designed to house the president and top officials, was damaged in a misaligned Soviet strike. The underground Raven Rock complex near Pennsylvania attempted to coordinate military remnants, but without intact communication lines, its reach was minimal. Military governors emerged around surviving bases, not by election, but by default. In Colorado Springs, an Air Force colonel declared martial law and began issuing local currency backed by food rations. In Northern California, a coalition of sheriffs, mayors, and surviving National Guard units declared the Republic of Pacifica and imposed strict borders at the Sierra Nevada passes. On the East Coast, chaos reigned. Fallout from New York, Washington, and Boston rendered large areas uninhabitable. Refugees swarmed westward, overwhelming the sparse infrastructure that remained. Roadblocks, once manned by state troopers, were taken over by armed citizen militias. New York State splintered into dozens of local fiefdoms. One group, calling themselves the Albany Covenant, demanded fealty to a constitution they had written from memory. In the Midwest, some semblance of order held. Portions of Iowa, Nebraska, and parts of Kansas had been spared the worst, and survivors there managed to maintain farming operations using pre-electric machinery. A new calendar was introduced, marking the first day of peace as Year Zero. By Year Zero, Month 2, these communities had formed what they called the Prairie Confederation, with a rotating council and rudimentary postal routes re-established by horse. But this was not America as it had been. It was 100 small Americas, each with its own rules, borders, and fears. In the Soviet Union, the collapse was even more pronounced. Unlike the U.S., and where federalism and decentralization offered at least theoretical resilience, the USSR depended on Moscow for nearly all administrative control. With the capital vaporized and most senior leadership annihilated, the periphery fragmented rapidly. Ukraine, already ravaged by strikes in Kiev and Kharkiv, fell into regional military command zones. In the Donbass, miners formed their own defensive brigades, controlling access to coal and food in exchange for weapons and medicine. Siberia, spared much of the initial destruction, became a contested frontier. Survivors from western Russia fled eastward, clashing with local authorities and indigenous populations. The Trans-Siberian Railway became a corridor of conflict, with each station manned by a different faction. In Novosibirsk, a group of surviving party members attempted to reconstitute the Soviet government, declaring the birth of the Second Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They were ignored by most. In the Baltic states, independence movements that had been forcibly suppressed for decades resurfaced, not in name, but in action. With Moscow gone, local militias reclaimed control of towns and borders. A shortwave broadcast from Riga, recorded by a Polish amateur operator, announced in broken Russian, "We are no longer yours, we are our own. Do not come." In Western Europe, the results were mixed. France had sustained limited damage due to a combination of geography and Soviet targeting errors. The French government, relocated to a secure facility in Clermont-Ferrand, attempted to assert continental leadership. But Paris was gone, and with it, the heart of French identity. President Charles de Gaulle, believed to have perished in the initial exchange, was later reported alive in Lyon, though no confirmation ever emerged. In the UK, the government at Whitehall ceased to function within hours of the London strike. The Prime Minister and senior ministers, believed dead or missing, left a power vacuum. In rural areas, the monarchy remained a symbolic unifier. Queen Elizabeth II was said to have been moved to a secure compound in Scotland, where she delivered a brief, heavily distorted radio address. The crown remains. Britain endures. Stand together. But the country was already breaking apart. In Birmingham, survivors declared a provisional council. In Cornwall, a local cleric led nightly processions and proclaimed the rebirth of the Kingdom of Wessex. In the Midlands, control fell to military remnants who imposed strict rationing and curfews. Northern Ireland descended into civil conflict as Catholic and Protestant factions vied for dwindling resources, their decades-long sectarian struggle reigniting with renewed fury. Africa and South America, largely spared direct strikes, faced a different kind of fragmentation. Cut off from aid, trade, and global finance, post-colonial states found themselves stranded. In Nigeria, regional governors began issuing their own decrees. In the Congo, warlords reasserted territorial control with child soldiers and stolen UN equipment. In Argentina and Chile, military juntas emerged, claiming to be the last legitimate governments on Earth. Brazil saw perhaps the most surreal development. The state of São Paulo, through sheer industrial resilience and isolation from fallout, declared itself a free technocratic republic and began reconstructing primitive communication systems. Whether their declarations reached anyone outside their borders is uncertain. China, already in the throes of the Great Leap Forward, descended into absolute madness. Without confirmation of Soviet survival and amid rumors of further strikes, Mao Zedong's regime collapsed inwards. Famine surged. Local cadres declared breakaway governments. One province proclaimed Mao's death and the arrival of a Red Phoenix, a mythical savior said to be born in the ashes. Cannibalism was reported in multiple districts. In India, the central government in New Delhi attempted to maintain order, but mass panic, refugee influx, and disease overwhelmed infrastructure. The Indian military assumed direct control of major cities, enforcing quarantine zones and rationed communications. Pakistan, already a volatile neighbor, mobilized what remained of its forces to secure disputed borders. Skirmishes erupted across Kashmir, with neither side certain if the other was acting on orders or instinct. Even neutral nations, those untouched by blast or fallout, were not immune to collapse. Switzerland, famed for its neutrality and preparedness, sealed its borders. The Swiss Guard fired upon refugees attempting to cross the Alps. In Geneva, the International Red Cross continued operations, issuing pleas via Morse and telex, but no responses came. Sweden descended into isolationist panic, cutting all contact and ordering mandatory conscription of men aged 14 and up. The Norwegian government disappeared from all records. Finland simply vanished. Thus, the world entered a new phase, one in which no flag held meaning, no government claimed legitimacy beyond rifle range, and the idea of country became a whispered memory. Maps, once authoritative, became curiosities. A child in Missouri, huddled in a church basement, pointed to a tattered globe and asked, "What is a United States?" No one answered, but something always rises from ashes. In isolated pockets, proto-governments began to emerge. In the American Northwest, a coalition of towns formed the Columbia Pact, creating a shared council and bartering system. Their emblem, a pine tree encircled by a ring of stars. In southern France, remnants of the French gendarmerie established a republic centered around Avignon. In the Ural Mountains, miners and scientists coalesced into a technocratic commune focused on radiation data and agricultural sustainability. Each of these new entities claimed legitimacy not from election or tradition, but from survival. They wrote new constitutions, invented flags, formed militias, reopened libraries, issued birth certificates and marriage licenses. Some minted coins from melted copper wiring. Others carved their laws into stone, literally. And in the silence left by the death of nations, a new language of power emerged, one of community, resource, and proximity. Those who controlled food, medicine, knowledge, they became governments. But they were not states, not yet. They were fragments of memory struggling to become more than stories. In the immediate aftermath of the 1962 nuclear war, as firestorms consumed the cities and radioactive ash blanketed the land, the survivors looked to the skies. and waited. They waited for the fires to cease, for the winds to calm, for the sun to rise again, unfiltered and unbroken. But the heavens offered no mercy. Instead, they delivered a twilight without end. The world entered what scientists, had there been any left to formally declare it, would later call nuclear autumn, swiftly deepening into a full nuclear winter. It began with the soot. The firestorms in urban centers like New York, London, Berlin, and Moscow generated immense convective columns, pillars of hot air so powerful they punched through the lower atmosphere and carried black smoke into the stratosphere, beyond the reach of rain and weather. Once there, the carbon particulates lingered. They spread slowly at first, then with devastating efficiency, forming a global shroud. Satellites, had they remained functional, would have seen a planet cloaked in a thin veil of charcoal gray. The atmosphere thickened with dust, radioactive isotopes, and vaporized matter, concrete, bone, plastic, ink, and ash. Within weeks, solar radiation reaching Earth's surface dropped by 70%. The sky, once blue and infinite, turned to the hue of bruised iron. At noon, it was as dim as dusk. At dusk, it was as black as pitch. Stars vanished. Birds ceased migration. Insects, already dying from the fallout, collapsed en masse as photosynthesis faltered. Temperatures plummeted. By December 1962, global average temperatures had fallen by nearly 4 degrees, with sharper drops in the northern hemisphere. Snow fell across the American South and parts of India. The Thames froze. In Kiev, a group of survivors carved a skating path through the river's solid surface, dragging carts of firewood behind them. They burned the boards from Soviet propaganda billboards to survive. In the southern hemisphere, the cooling was less severe but still marked. In Argentina, grape harvests failed. In Australia, the wheat belt reported yields down by 60%. In South Africa, locusts, disoriented and starving, swarmed settlements in feudal hunger. But it was in the tropics, where food had always grown most abundantly, that the crisis metastasized. With the sun diminished, rainfall patterns shifted. Monsoons failed, rivers dried, soil cracked and refused the plow. The global agricultural system, already shattered by the war's infrastructural impact, now simply ceased to function. In Iowa, seed grain was devoured by starving farmers before the next planting. In Punjab, diesel tractors sat idle, their fuel siphoned off to run generators for makeshift radios. In China, surviving cadres organized digging teams to unearth old stockpiles of millet and corn buried in collective farm bunkers. Most were already spoiled. Hunger became the new universal currency. In refugee zones across Central Europe, bread was bartered for antibiotics. In former American suburbs, canned beans became a unit of exchange. Children were traded for food in some places, not always for eating, but sometimes tragically so. The global famine, unlike the bombs, came slowly. It did not roar, it crept, it reduced. It waited in silence and in patience, gnawing at the marrow of civilization. Estimates are elusive, but based on fragmentary population records, over 1.5 billion people perished from starvation between January 1963 and the end of 1965. More would die from the diseases that followed: typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, all thriving in cold, weakened bodies without clean water or shelter. The surviving ecosystems were equally traumatized. Trees lost their leaves out of season and did not regrow them. Many died. Photosynthesis faltered, and entire forests, especially in the northern hemisphere, turned into skeletal graveyards. Without sufficient vegetation, oxygen production dropped measurably, a fact recorded by one Brazilian meteorological station which operated into mid-1963 before falling silent. Domesticated animals, deprived of grain and forage, were slaughtered en masse or left to starve. Wild animals, especially herbivores, suffered equally. Deer populations crashed. In Siberia, wolves turned to cannibalism. In parts of Canada, bear sightings in urban ruins increased, driven not by curiosity but by desperate hunger. Marine ecosystems did not escape. The oceans, long believed to be immune to terrestrial folly, absorbed vast amounts of radioactive fallout from atmospheric rainout. Plankton populations, the very basis of the food web, dropped precipitously. Fish harvests collapsed. Beaches were strewn with the carcasses of whales whose sonar had been disrupted by shifts in magnetic fields and ocean temperature. The sun itself became a memory. Children born after the war grew up without ever seeing it. In Kentucky, a teacher who still kept a journal described trying to explain the sun to her students. "It is round, warm and yellow," she wrote. They did not understand yellow. Religious movements responded to the dimming in myriad ways. Some saw it as punishment, divine retribution for the sins of man. Others interpreted the darkened skies as a prelude to apocalypse. Cults proliferated. In the Andes, a group of survivors declared that the sun had fled the earth and would only return with a sacrifice. They burned the last known copy of Don Quixote as an offering. In Kansas, an itinerant preacher claimed that each clouded day was a test, and that those who smiled through it would enter a new Eden. He died of exposure within the month. Desperate governments, or the fractured remnants thereof, attempted agricultural experiments to save what remained. In Scotland, greenhouses were constructed using salvaged car windows and street lamps. They grew moss. In Japan, scientists sheltered in underground rail tunnels began cultivating mushrooms and algae. In Ethiopia, a group of monks reintroduced ancient terrace farming with partial success, using soot-washed stones to absorb residual warmth. But large-scale farming was no longer possible. The sun no longer shone with enough strength to nurture grain, and the global supply chains that had once ferried fertilizers and seeds were gone. And so began what historians, generations later, would call the era of the Pale Harvest. It was an age of subsistence and scavenging, of lichen and bark, of moss scraped from concrete. An age in which the rituals of farming were replaced by foraging, in which the calendar was no longer divided by seasons, but by survivals. And still, the cold endured. For 5 long years, until mid-1967, the planet remained gripped by reduced sunlight and stunted warmth. Only then, with time and the slow settling of atmospheric particles, did the skies begin to clear. But the Earth that emerged into light was not the Earth that had known it. The growing zones had shifted. The species balance was forever altered. The ozone layer, having absorbed immense radiation and chlorinated compounds, had been perforated. UV radiation surged. Skin cancers became common. Survivors shielded themselves with soot or mud. In Iceland, villagers wore fish skins sewn into tunics to ward off the rays. In New Zealand, entire communities lived in caves until dusk. And then there were the children, the ones born after. Many were blind. Others bore deformities. Some could not speak. But some adapted. They grew lean, silent, and watchful. They learned to find edible fungi beneath collapsed supermarkets, to hear the difference between safe water and poisoned rain. They were the first citizens of a new Earth, one sculpted not by evolution, but by catastrophe. And in their silence, in their stoic gaze beneath the half-returned sun, for it was a question no longer spoken aloud, what have we inherited? The calendar had ceased to matter. By the time the planet stumbled into October of 1963, few could say with certainty what day it was. The sun had become unreliable, the stars obscured, and the ancient metronomes of harvest, bloom, and thaw had been severed from the rhythms of daily life. Time in this broken world was measured instead by intervals of necessity, from one fire to the next, from one scavenging journey to another, from one death to one burial. The first year after the war, often referred to by survivors as simply the year after, was characterized not by rebuilding, nor by mourning, but by a strange, continuous state of endurance. People did not live so much as persist. They did not hope. They continued. That was all. Across the ruins of North America, the morning routine, for those with enough shelter to distinguish morning from night, began with silence. Fires were lit, if wood remained. Ash was scraped from hearths to expose the faintest ember, coaxed back into life with threadbare paper and twigs. Smoke blackened the ceilings of barns and basements. In homes without chimneys, holes were knocked through plaster and brick, leaving charred wounds that bled soot whenever the wind changed. Children awoke slowly, not to alarm clocks, but to cold. No one rushed. Movement was sparse and calculated. Each step spent calories that could not be replaced. Each task, from fetching water to stitching a torn coat, was weighed against exhaustion. Food was the central preoccupation. In the cities, or what remained of them, survivors foraged endlessly through ruined grocery stores, their aisles transformed into tombs. Glass crunched underfoot, packaging warped from heat and time. Canned goods were gold, though many had begun to spoil. In some places, forgotten vending machines were pried open with crowbars, their rusted interiors offering candy bars melted into lumps, now refrozen in the cold. In the countryside, survival was tied to ingenuity. Some cultivated mushrooms in collapsed root cellars. Others raised rats in cages, feeding them scraps and drying their meat over smoky fires. Pond scum was scraped and filtered into something barely edible. In Canada, old First Nations knowledge was resurrected. Birch bark, tea, acorn flour, fish traps made from fallen pine. And always the hunger. It was ever present, not acute, like famine once known in history books, but dull and chronic, like an ache that had become part of the body. Adults hid their hunger to give more to their children. The elderly stopped eating altogether, slipping quietly into death in order to feed others. In some encampments, hunger led to whispers of meat that came from no animal. Water was its own battleground. Rivers, once lifelines of civilization, had turned to poison in many areas. Fallout dust settled into reservoirs and wells. Rain could not be trusted, dark, oily, and acrid. In Poland, villagers boiled it 3 times, straining it through cloth and charcoal. In the American Rockies, snowmelt was harvested, filtered with sand, and consumed in sips. Diarrhea was common. So was dehydration. Children's lips cracked into bloodied crevices. Adults urinated once a day, if at all. Despite the silence, disease spread. Without antibiotics or sterile tools, infections that would have once been trivial became death sentences. A splinter could kill. A toothache could turn septic. Colds led to pneumonia. Corpses lay in shallow graves, if they were buried at all. Dogs, feral and desperate, returned to old instincts. Packs roamed the outskirts of settlements. They had learned to fear humans and to hunt them. Communication, once global, was reduced to shouts and smoke. Radios for a time offered hope. Here and there, scattered shortwave signals would crackle through the static. A preacher in Alabama quoting scripture, a coded military message from somewhere in the Urals, a voice in Japanese repeating a single phrase, "We endure, we endure." But most of the airwaves were silent. The great voices of the 20th century, Roosevelt, Churchill, Khrushchev, Kennedy, were now only echoes in dead machines. Libraries, when they could be found, were stripped for paper. Books became kindling. Knowledge, once housed in institutions and universities, now depended entirely on memory. Elders became priceless. Those who remembered how to preserve food, how to make soap, how to set a bone, or how to find direction without the sun, they were protected, respected, and sometimes worshipped. In one settlement near Denver, a former biology teacher taught children how to identify edible plants. In another, an old woman who once taught sewing became revered for her ability to make clothes from sackcloth and thread pulled from carpets. In Liverpool, a man who had once been a low-level clerk in a power station managed to rig a wind-powered generator and light a single bulb for an hour each evening. He was thereafter referred to as the Lamp Father. Spirituality filled the void where structure had once been. Formal religion surged in places, collapsed in others. Some saw the war as divine punishment, others saw it as proof of godlessness. Makeshift churches arose from burned barns, often lit only by candlelight and inhabited by silence. In California, a group of survivors claimed to hear music in the wind, calling it the voice of the new earth. In Belarus, children were taught that the sky had closed because humans had failed a cosmic test. Many ceased to believe in anything. They lived not by faith nor principle, but by instinct. Morality, like everything else, was subject to redefinition. Theft was no longer crime. It was hunger. Ownership meant little when homes had no roofs. Marriage became survival pacts. Love still existed, but it was quieter, grittier. A hand held in the cold, a scrap of food saved for another, a lullaby sung underground. Governance barely existed. There were no police, no courts, no taxes. Justice was administered by consensus or by necessity. In some towns, elders formed councils. In others, armed men ruled. In a pocket of southern France, decisions were made through a system of stones in a jar. Black for no, white for yes. In Chile, survivors gathered each week and read aloud from a salvaged copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, believing it still mattered somehow. And there was, through it all, an ache for memory. People kept journals, not out of hope for publication, but out of desperation that someone might remember. Parents told stories to their children, not fairy tales, but stories of before, of cars, of films, of cold drinks and warm showers, of laughter that wasn't nervous. One man in Finland etched his memories into slabs of concrete, one per day, stacking them into a silent tower. It stood for 5 months before collapsing in a storm. Nature, though scarred, began to reclaim space. Grass pushed through cracked pavement. Trees, though bare, stood silently against the gray wind. Wolves returned to cities. In parts of Africa and the Amazon, untouched by direct destruction, ecosystems began to flourish anew, now freed from the pressure of global extraction. But humanity, where it still clung to life, remained bent and weary. In some corners, hope flickered. In upstate New York, a group of survivors constructed a school in a barn. They taught reading by candlelight, using torn pages from encyclopedias. In Norway, 2 villages dug a tunnel between them and shared resources. In Kazakhstan, a scientist devised a hand-cranked Geiger counter from salvaged parts and taught others how to use it. These were small things, but they were human things. And so the first year after the fire came and went, not with fireworks or celebration, but with the sound of breathing, labored, persistent, undeniable. The world had not healed, but neither had it ended. They were born not into a world, but into a condition, one marked by gray skies, muffled wind, and the strange quiet that settled over ruined nations. They came from wombs nourished by tainted food and poisoned water, carried by mothers whose blood bore isotopes of strontium and cesium. Their cradles were drawers, blankets were sackcloth, and lullabies were whispered through cracked lips. They were the children of ash, and they would become the first generation shaped entirely by the war that ended the old world. From 1963 through 1968, scattered settlements across the northern hemisphere saw the birth of thousands of infants under impossible circumstances. No hospitals, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Just the flicker of firelight, the sound of boiling water, and a prayer, whether to God, to memory, or to nothing at all. Many did not survive. The statistics, though fragmentary, suggest that in certain areas, and particularly within the blast radius zones of North America, Central Europe, and the Western USSR, infant mortality reached over 80%. Some died in the womb, others in the first hours of life. Congenital deformities became tragically common. Limbs fused, spines twisted, eyes clouded by cataracts at birth. Radiation had not just killed, it had rewritten biology. And yet, some children survived. They were smaller than children once were, and quieter. They rarely cried. Some speculated that they instinctively knew it drew predators. Many had unusually sharp hearing and remarkable night vision, perhaps born of gestation in perpetual twilight. Others seemed especially attuned to danger. One child in the Balkans reportedly learned to detect the presence of gamma-contaminated water by smell alone. In truth, we cannot say what was mutation and what was adaptation. Nature, under duress, had been forced to gamble. Their parents, those who had endured the long silence, looked upon them with conflicting awe and grief. These children would never know the pre-war world. They would not learn history in schools. They would not see planes in the sky or ride bicycles through safe streets. They would grow not with dreams of progress, but with the weight of survival. In the wastes of northern France, children were raised on stories of lost wonders, machines that flew, devices that sang, boxes of light that showed other people's lives. In India, older survivors painted murals in caves, not of gods, but of telephones, trains, and apples. In Alaska, an elder taught children to draw the sun as it once was, full, golden, fierce. The children did not understand. To them, the sky was always gray. But they were not blank slates. They formed cultures of necessity. In the Great Lakes region, youth bands emerged, composed of adolescents who scavenged in groups and used a complex whistling language to communicate. In Japan, post-war settlements developed rudimentary martial arts systems based on self-defense from feral dogs and raiders. In the Caucasus, young children invented new alphabets, scrawling their own signs and pictograms on stone walls, a written language no one had taught them, born of instinct and play. In these children, new myths began to grow. Without textbooks or teachers, memory transformed into legend. The United States became the land of fires. Russia was called the sleeping bear. Nuclear bombs were spoken of as sky hammers or the Great White Death. The sun, absent so long from their childhoods, was imagined by some as a traitor who had fled the earth in disgust. One oral tale, collected decades later by post-collapse historians, told of a giant machine that had eaten the world's happiness, forcing people to wear suits made of lightning. Another described a war between birds and stars in which the stars won, but both sides died. It was, perhaps, the birth of new folklore, the seeds of future civilizations. Yet not all was poetry. The social structure of post-war settlements was shaped deeply by these new children. In many communities, child-rearing became a collective duty. With few surviving women of childbearing age, each infant was seen as a communal resource, a chance for the human species to continue. Parents often relinquished children to the group, especially in nomadic or tribal formations that arose in the ruins of cities. Some settlements organized formal rites of passage. In Norway, for example, when a child reached age 7, they were sent on a solo scavenging mission and only welcomed back if they returned with food or knowledge. In Kazakhstan, children were taught to memorize the names of every pre-war capital, recited like a mantra: London, Paris, Rome, Ottawa, Washington, Moscow, even though they would never visit them. In southern China, one settlement reportedly marked puberty with a ritual tattoo, using ash and bone, a circle, a flame, a hand. The psychology of the children of ash remains a subject of fascination for historians. Raised in trauma, surrounded by ruin, they nevertheless displayed a remarkable emotional resilience. They formed bonds quickly and deeply. They developed sophisticated systems of empathy, recognizing hunger, grief, or fear in others without need for speech. In Argentina, observers noted that children born after the war touched one another constantly, on the shoulder, arm, face, as though to reassure themselves of presence and warmth. However, there were also shadows. Some children developed complete mutism, not from physical defect, but from emotional withdrawal. Others displayed early signs of what would now be classified as PTSD, hypervigilance, aggression, and dissociation. In parts of Poland, entire groups of children lived without language for years, communicating only in gestures and mimicry. Still, they carried forward. By 1969, the first of the children of Ash were entering adolescence. They began to shape the New World more actively, not just as heirs, but as agents. They devised tools from scrap. They rebuilt wells. They organized night watches. They carved games into the earth with sticks and played them beneath clouded skies. In one instance, recorded by a lone anthropologist in the ruins of Ankara, a group of teenagers constructed a wooden archive. A hut filled with scraps of paper, etched bone, and coded messages. They called it the Memory House, a sanctuary for stories. It stood for 3 winters before a fire took it. Even so, the idea had taken root. The children of Ash were not merely survivors. They were founders, not of nations, yet, not of technology or democracy, but of something more primal, a sense of continuity, a refusal to end. Through them, the ember of human civilization remained lit, buried beneath layers of soot and sorrow, glowing faintly still. And in them, the world had its first fragile glimpse of a future, not defined by what had been lost, but by what might yet be made. It began, as so many things in the post-war world did, with a signal, a burst of static, then a voice, faint, garbled, indistinct. It was detected in late 1967 on a salvaged shortwave set deep in the ruins of Minsk. The voice was speaking French, not fluent, but recognizable, and it repeated a phrase every 30 seconds. Alive in Geneva, seeking contact. Repeat, alive in Geneva. At first, the group who heard it assumed it to be a relic, an old broadcast echoing through the ether, a ghost of a world that no longer was. But the signal repeated the next day, and the next. A week later, it changed frequency. Someone, somewhere, was still trying. The survivors of Belarus, hardened by 5 winters of starvation and blight, had no means to reach Geneva, but the message spread. Word of it traveled by foot, by whispers, by scavengers who had memorized the names of places that once meant something. A year later, in 1968, that same signal was picked up in the outskirts of Prague. This time, someone answered. Thus began what would become known in historical memory as the Ash diplomacy, the first tentative steps toward re-establishing contact between isolated enclaves of humanity, scattered across the wastelands of the Northern Hemisphere like embers waiting to be fanned into flame. It was not the return of nation-states, not yet, but it was something. Geneva became the first recognized hub of post-war communication. Remarkably spared from direct strikes, its mountainous geography had shielded the city from the worst fallout. The surrounding Swiss valleys, long accustomed to self-sufficiency, had transitioned quickly into survivalist mode. Hydropower stations, though damaged, had been partially restored by engineers who had once worked for CERN. By 1966, the survivors had rigged up a functioning broadcast tower using salvaged parts from the international airport. They called themselves simply Les Gardiens, the keepers. Their purpose was not domination, but connection. And so they sent out signals in every language they remembered: German, English, Russian, Arabic, Mandarin, Esperanto. They repeated names of cities, names of rivers, names of scientists, in the hope that someone might remember, or recognize, and in time, someone did. In the mountains of Iran, a surviving fragment of what had once been a university radio station responded in cautious Farsi. They called themselves Yekta Yetazeh, the new unity. Their message was not one of politics or alliance, but of trade. They had salt, dates, and goat herds. They sought antibiotics and tools. This was how diplomacy began, not in grand chambers with flags, but in traded words and simple barter. From these early contacts, a fragile network began to emerge. It was known unofficially as the Ring, a loose confederation of communicating settlements and regions, stretching from Switzerland to Iran, from the Nordic coasts to parts of southern India. Each new link in the Ring was a cause for celebration, not because it signaled the return of civilization as it had once been, but because it affirmed something even more vital. We are not alone. Yet the Ring was not without conflict. Some survivor states refused all contact. In eastern Ukraine, a militarized zone known only as Kremny responded to Geneva's signal with a chilling message: stay silent or be silenced. No outsiders, no questions. Reports from refugees suggested a heavily armed autocratic society built around absolute control of remaining resources. Entry was forbidden. Exit was punished. Inhabitants were tattooed with barcodes on their forearms. Other enclaves were less aggressive, but no less opaque. In northern Canada, a group identified only as the Seven answered with a signal that played only music, one violin, looping the same melody over and over, never speaking. Whether it was a code, a warning, or a ritual, no one could say. Trade, where it occurred, was painstaking. With no functioning currencies, barter was the norm. Salt was valuable. So was clean water. Antibiotics were priceless. Ammunition was sometimes accepted as a form of currency, though always with the risk that the recipient might use it against the giver. A form of standardization began to emerge by necessity. Items were traded in bundles: a bundle of rations, a bundle of cloth, a bundle of fuel. These bundles were marked with a notch system carved into wood. 2 notches for medicinal bundles, 1 for tools, 3 for food. It was primitive, but it worked, and where words failed, symbols took over. The old flags were gone. In their place, new emblems emerged. Geneva used the image of a spiral sun, symbolizing both darkness and return. Iran's Yekta used a simple tree with 4 roots, representing survival through unity. In the remnants of East Africa, a newly formed coalition used the image of a flame encircled by hands. These symbols were painted on walls, stitched into cloth, carved into rock. They were not national flags. They were signs of life. The most ambitious attempt at post-war diplomacy came in 1970, with the formation of what would later be called the Lattice Conference. Organized by Geneva, it involved representatives from over 14 surviving enclaves. The gathering took place not in Geneva itself, but in a valley outside Vaduz, Liechtenstein, chosen for its remoteness and neutrality. There were no suits or formal addresses. Attendees wore patchwork coats, traveled by foot or mule, and spoke through interpreters seated on overturned barrels. The agenda was simple: confirm the continued existence of each group, share survival knowledge, medicine, agriculture, shelter, discuss mutual defense from predatory raiders, explore reestablishing long-range communication systems. No binding treaties were signed. There were no grand declarations. But for the first time since the bombs had fallen, human beings from across continents sat together, shared bread, and spoke of tomorrow. And that mattered. There were failures too. A delegation from northern Italy never arrived. Their trail later discovered to have been ambushed by bandits from the Alps. A representative from Cairo died of infection en route. The Second Lattice Conference, planned for 1972, was canceled after a resurgence of famine in the Balkans. Still, the seed had been planted. Ash diplomacy was not about grand alliances or power blocks. It was at its heart about recognition, the mutual acknowledgement that others had survived, that others remembered, that others cared. Through it, the post-war world began to resemble something beyond mere subsistence. It became a web of slow trust, built not on ideology or empire, but on shared fragility. And in that fragility, there was strength. For perhaps the first time in modern history, diplomacy was not a performance. It was a lifeline. In the long shadow of the atomic fires, as the soot settled and radiation dispersed into the crust of memory, human beings began to ask again, what does it mean to live together? When the systems of state, market, and machine had all been shattered, when cities were bones and nations were echoes, people did not simply survive. They created. What they created was not a return. It was reinvention. By the early 1970s, distinct cultural identities had begun to emerge among the scattered enclaves of survivors. These were not mere continuations of pre-war national cultures. They were, rather, syntheses of trauma, memory, geography, and necessity. The social patterns of the post-fall world were shaped not by ideology, but by environment, by how people had survived, with whom, and at what cost. Consider the fjord tribes of Scandinavia. Scattered across the broken coastal villages of Norway and western Sweden, these communities formed around principles of collective silence. Traumatized by years of hiding from radioactive winds and northern fallout storms, their elders enforced a cultural code in which speaking aloud was reserved for ceremonies or danger. Children were taught to communicate through gestures, hand signs, and music, low-humming tones that echoed across the fjords. By 1974, these tribes had developed a tonal language of over 120 distinct melodic signals, used for greetings, warnings, storytelling, and even courtship. They called this tradition Tonsprach, speech of tone. Visitors were baffled, but for the fjord tribes it was second nature. In contrast stood the vault communes of Central Asia. Built around ancient Soviet bunkers and forgotten missile silos, these groups inherited a culture of rigid hierarchy and technical reverence. Knowledge was sacred. Engineers were priests. Manuals were scripture. Their society developed along technocratic lines with ranks based on mechanical skill, electrical understanding, and coding ability. A 1975 field report described a ceremony in which children recited resistor color codes as a rite of passage. Black, brown, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, gray, white. Those who succeeded were allowed to wear copper-threaded sashes. Those who failed repeated the year under mentorship. The vault communes believed deeply in merit, but only of the practical kind. Meanwhile, in the southern hemisphere, where the bombs had struck less directly, new forms of hybrid civilization began to form. In southern Brazil, along the plateaus of Paraná, survivors from diverse urban centers merged with indigenous communities and rural cooperatives. The result was a decentralized federation called As Aldeias do Fim do Mundo, the villages of the end of the world. They used no money. Land was communal. Leadership rotated every 4 seasons and was decided by lottery, a principle derived from the belief that power should not be sought, only accepted when called. Their oral traditions combined Catholic iconography with Guarani cosmology and atomic symbolism. One popular myth told of Nossa Senhora da Fumaça, Our Lady of Smoke, a figure who wept for the poisoned skies and guided children through dreams of the pre-war forests. In West Africa, particularly in Senegal and Guinea, a cultural revival of griot-based transmission emerged. With books mostly lost, professional storytellers, known as les porteurs de braises, carriers of embers, traveled between settlements, passing history, law, and spiritual guidance through epic poetry. Their tales were structured to encode calendars, planting techniques, and even basic medical advice. This was knowledge as performance, woven into rhyme so that it would not be forgotten. In the Australian interior, a different model prevailed. Survivor communities near Alice Springs formed the Solar Orders, semi-nomadic groups who worshipped the sun not as god, but as judge. Their belief system revolved around the idea that humanity had been punished for trying to capture the power of stars. Rituals were conducted at dawn and dusk. Fires were strictly regulated. The concept of illumination was both literal and spiritual, to bring light to darkness, but never to challenge the sun itself. Their laws were based on solar cycles, with offenses judged according to season. Theft during winter, when resources were scarce, was punished harshly. Theft during summer, a time of relative plenty, was met with exile and fasting, but not violence. Across the globe, other systems emerged. In the ruins of Istanbul, a society known as the Red Mosaic developed, composed of orphaned children raised by a surviving network of librarians and linguists. Their culture prioritized plurality. No single truth, no official language, no formal leadership. Decisions were made in rotating councils, with voting stones rather than paper or speech. They recorded their history in layers of painted murals across abandoned buildings, using images instead of words. Their motto was simple: many voices, one memory. In Antarctica, of all places, one of the strangest post-war societies arose. A multinational research station, partially spared by distance and weather, became a permanent settlement of fewer than 500 people. Cut off for years, they developed a Creole language, Antarglossa, blending English, Russian, Spanish, and Inuktitut. Their society was strictly rotational. Every adult had to learn all basic roles: doctoring, cooking, repairs, mediation. No one could do the same job 2 months in a row. They believed deeply in impermanence. Every structure was temporary. Every argument was reversible. Even their burial practices involved shallow snow graves that melted with time, returning the dead to the ice. What united these emergent civilizations was not form or ideology, but a shared sense of being after. They were the inheritors not of nations, but of collapse. And their cultures, while diverse in surface, were profoundly similar in spirit. They valued memory, but were not shackled to it. They honored survival, but not at the cost of compassion. They embraced adaptation, even when it contradicted tradition. And crucially, most of them, in word or practice, had rejected the technological arrogance that had led to the firestorms of 1962. Nuclear energy, in particular, had become taboo. Even among the communes, nuclear knowledge was referred to as the forbidden current. In oral tales from Pacific survivors, radiation was described as a demon mist, something that crept silently and punished the greedy. Children were told never to pick metal that shone green, lest they awaken the old heat. Yet these were not entirely societies of fear. Many embraced ritual as a means of healing. From solemn ash dances in the Balkans to rain-calling ceremonies in the former Sahel, from reconstructed solstice observances in Canada to the quiet bell rings of Siberian forest communes, humanity's need for meaning had not been extinguished, only transmuted. By 1976, one could trace on a map over 36 distinct civilizational clusters, each with its own norms, spiritual outlooks, and economic arrangements. They were not global powers. They did not seek dominance. Most barely knew each other existed, but they endured. And in so doing, they proved what no ideology ever had, that civilization is not built from technology, but from intention, from the will to organize, to remember, to share, and to imagine together. These new civilizations did not rebuild the old world. They built their own. When the last missiles fell, they did not merely obliterate cities, they disintegrated myths. The capitals that had once projected power over continents were now craters of silence. Yet, from the scorched edges of these lost metropoles, rumors began to stir. Rumors that perhaps someone had survived, that perhaps the command structures had retreated underground, that perhaps some ember of empire still glowed, waiting. Let us first turn our gaze to Washington, D.C., the former nerve center of the United States of America. In the first years following the exchange, no coherent signals emerged from the East Coast. The capital had taken a direct hit from a high-yield thermonuclear warhead, detonated at airburst altitude. The iconic domes of the Capitol and the White House were vaporized in milliseconds. The Potomac boiled. The National Archives incinerated. No one expected anything to remain. And yet, around 1966, a faint broadcast was detected across the Appalachian Basin. It repeated one phrase in slow, mechanical cadence. Continuity confirmed. Echo Station 7. Awaiting authentication. The source of the signal was traced not to the ruins of Washington itself, but deep beneath the mountains of Raven Rock, Pennsylvania, a known Cold War military redoubt. Historians would later learn that the continuity of government plan had in fact partially activated. A few senior military officials, along with support staff and supplies, had sealed themselves within the Raven Rock mountain complex as the war commenced. But there had been no one left to lead. No president, no Congress, only a handful of uniformed men and women following outdated protocols and clinging to codes issued in the final hours. For a time, they continued operations. They conducted internal drills, maintained servers and shortwave antennas. He even issued simulated threat assessments about non-existent foreign incursions. But their reality grew increasingly circular, based on old procedures that no longer applied. When a scavenger team made contact in 1971, they found a skeleton crew still alive, physically intact, but mentally fractured. The commander, a man named Call, Erwin Drakes reportedly asked, as the president returned to the surface, they had become echoes of their own doctrine, automated relics of a defunct hierarchy. Their complex was eventually sealed from the outside. The broadcast ceased in 1973. Meanwhile, in the vast desolation of Russia, the ghost of Moscow was even harder to trace. Moscow had suffered not one, but multiple strikes, delivered by submarine-launched ballistic missiles and intercontinental warheads. The city's once grand avenues and onion-domed cathedrals were reduced to irradiated ash within seconds. The Kremlin, the Ministry of Defense, and KGB headquarters, all erased. And yet, the myth of a surviving Soviet command structure persisted for decades. There were whispered references to Podzemny Grad, the underground city, a facility reportedly located deep beneath the Ural Mountains. Before the war, it had been rumored among Soviet insiders as a classified metro network bunker capable of housing over 10,000 people. Post-war travelers, risking radiation and hostile patrols, claimed to have seen strange aircraft flying without markings near Chelyabinsk. In 1972, a refugee caravan passing through the Volga region spoke of uniformed figures intercepting travelers, interrogating them in Russian, and confiscating technology. Their uniforms bore no insignia, only a red triangle with a black star. Some survivors came to believe that a fragment of the Politburo had survived underground, establishing a secretive regime known only as Kovcheg, the Ark. Whether Kovcheg was real or merely a story told around fires to give shape to unaccounted threats, no definitive evidence emerged. But abandoned listening posts in Finland, maintained by Swedish scientists, recorded brief bursts of coded Russian in 1975. The content, once deciphered, referred to satellite telemetry, thermal drift correction, and, ominously, dead hand override confirmed. This final phrase triggered intense speculation. Before the war, the USSR had developed a semi-automated nuclear retaliation system known as Perimeter, or Dead Hand, a network that could launch a second strike even if all human command had been eliminated. If some remnant of this system had survived, even partially, it posed the existential question, was the war truly over, or merely paused? Farther east, the fate of Beijing was even more elusive. Unlike Washington and Moscow, Beijing was struck late in the sequence, possibly in retaliation for a final salvo aimed at U.S. Pacific bases. The warheads that hit China's capital were of variable yield but high density. The resulting firestorms killed millions in minutes. Entire districts collapsed into flaming sinkholes as old brickwork and reinforced concrete failed under the heat. But China had planned differently. Before the war, the People's Republic had developed what was known as the Underground Great Wall, a vast network of tunnels, bunkers, and train lines built into mountainous regions of Hunan, Sichuan, and Shanxi. It was here that some claimed the Central Military Commission had relocated. Indeed, survivors from western villages began to report unusual sightings: long black trains moving by night, masked figures bearing red armbands, loudspeakers playing music from the Maoist era. The name Xu Ling, or the cultivated spirit, began to appear in stories, a title given to an elusive leader who was said to have inherited the mantle of Chairman Mao. This figure, never seen in public, was described as ruling from a city beneath the mountains, maintaining order through radio sermons and doctrine known as the New Red Path. Whatever the truth, it became clear that something survived in western China. Trade caravans who brought offerings of rice or ore were occasionally rewarded with advanced medical kits, tools, or even printed booklets, always in simplified Chinese, bearing the red seal of Xu Ling. Though the Chinese heartland remained a no-go zone due to lingering radiation, these stories suggested the possible rise of a post-Maoist technocracy, silent and methodical, rebuilding out of view. These three centers, Raven Rock, Kovcheg, and Xu Ling, formed what later historians called the Silent Triangle. They represented not functioning states, but vestigial authorities, fragments of former empires, each clinging to a different version of order. And then there were the symbols. Old flags became taboo. In the African, South American, and oceanic enclaves, wearing the stars and stripes, the hammer and sickle, or the 5 stars of China was considered dangerous, an invitation to suspicion or violence. Survivors blamed these powers not just for the war, but for the hubris that had caused it. In many communes, children were taught not to say the names America, Russia, or China. Instead, they were referred to as the Blind Giant, the Iron Ghost, the Sleeping Dragon. Books that mentioned them were burned. Monuments were toppled. In several places, even old coins were melted down and recast to remove faces and emblems. Yet in some circles, secret, cultic, or nostalgic, the names persisted in reverence. There were reports of a sect in northern Arizona calling itself the Sons of Liberty, who worshipped a tattered American flag and recited the Constitution by candlelight. In the Carpathians, a society of old officers preserved worn Soviet uniforms and trained children in Cold War drills. In Inner Mongolia, travelers whispered of a mountain shrine containing Mao's portrait, bathed in lantern light, guarded by monks who never spoke. In every case, these were not resurrections of nations. They were fetishes of memory, the last reverberations of powers that had once commanded the earth. And so, as the second post-war decade drew to a close, the world stood divided between the new civilizations, who looked forward, and the echo powers, who looked only backward. The truth was clear. Washington, Moscow, and Beijing were dead, but their shadows still moved. It did not end in surrender. It did not end in peace accords signed in grand halls. It ended in silence, in the slow erosion of memory, in the burial of names, in the quiet turning away from all that had once seemed unshakable. The Cold War, that great game of brinkmanship and ideology, had burned itself out in the crucible of 1962. But what followed was not resolution. It was something deeper, dissolution. By the early 1980s, those who had been children at the time of the exchange were now adults. For them, the pre-war world was not a place but a myth, spoken of in fragments, taught in cautionary tones, half remembered in dreams and relics. They knew of things called cars, satellites, and television, but they had never seen them function. They had heard of countries called France, India, or Brazil, but to them those words were as abstract as Atlantis or Babylon. The Cold War, for this generation, was not a conflict. It was a cataclysmic parable, like the flood or the fall of Rome, a story told not for strategy or scholarship, but for warning, and that was its true end. No declarations, no reconciliation, only myth, cauterized into memory. In North America, the ruins of cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and Philadelphia had become sacred zones, forbidden to enter, spoken of with reverence. Some communes left offerings at the edges of irradiated zones, whispering apologies to those who had burned for our pride. The language of geopolitics had faded. The word nation was rarely used. Instead, people spoke of circles, clans, spheres, or kinlands. In Europe, especially the former German territories, a form of active forgetting had taken root. Community elders would strike the names of old leaders from oral records. Maps were drawn without borders. History was divided into 2 eras, before the fire and after the silence. Young people were discouraged from learning about missiles, presidents, premiers, or parties. Even the concept of a war between ideas seemed incomprehensible to those who had inherited only ash. In the Andes, a school of philosophy known as Los Hermanos de la Tierra Clara, the Brothers of the Clear Earth, taught that memory itself could be a toxin, and that true peace came only when the mind was cleared of ambition, comparison, and inheritance. They built no archives. They planted no flags. Their mantra was, remember only the rain. But not all chose forgetting. In isolated corners, the Cold War persisted in ritual. In the highlands of Ethiopia, one could still find a crumbling American embassy compound, occupied by elders who claimed to be the last envoys of liberty. They maintained a shrine around a weather-beaten bust of President John F. Kennedy, lighting candles at dusk and reading translated excerpts of the U.S. Constitution aloud, though few understood the words. In what had once been Belarus, a surviving missile silo had become a subterranean monastic order. The monks called themselves the Watchers, and they lived in constant prayer beneath murals of mushroom clouds. They believed the world would one day repeat its sin unless eternal vigilance was maintained. In central Mongolia, a yearly ritual known as the Day of Two Suns commemorated the flash of the first detonation witnessed by nomads decades prior. Children would paint their faces white and sit in silence from dawn to dusk. The adults spoke only once, at noon, saying, "We saw the face of fire. We turned away. We live." Elsewhere, myths had absorbed the Cold War entirely. In sub-Saharan Africa, one oral tradition told of two sky beasts, Uramu and Karsala, who fought over who would own the wind. Their fight shook the mountains, darkened the sun, and poisoned the earth. The people, caught between them, took no side. When the beasts destroyed each other, the people rebuilt, slowly, differently, and without kings. The tale bore no mention of countries, ideologies, or bombs, and yet its symbolism was unmistakable. So ended the Cold War, not in victory or diplomacy, but in diffusion, like ink in water. It became everything, and so it became nothing. The world that emerged in its place was quieter, fewer people, smaller societies, no global communications, no standing armies, no central banks, yet also no superpowers, no nuclear arsenals, no race to dominate orbit or ideology. It was a world in which children grew up not fearing them, but fire, not worried about borders, but about seasons, not dreaming of conquest, but of harvest, healing, and light. The Cold War had always promised catastrophe if pushed too far, and when it came, it did not disappoint. But what no one expected, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev nor Mao, was that catastrophe would also birth a different kind of world. Not better, not worse, just quieter. And perhaps, in that quiet, the human story had found a way to begin again, not as a continuation of empires, but as a memory with softened edges,